in our space, we've planted over 120 different species of native plants over the last 9 years. Some of them have done extremely well, some not as well. And in fact, in terms of challenges, I think one of the things is keeping the aggressive species where you want them, and also making sure that they're not taking over some of the less aggressive species if you don't want them to. So probably the sun is where you find a lot of aggression going on among plants. And so some of these spaces have changed a lot over the years. But one of our favorites is the native trumpet honeysuckle or coral honeysuckle. And that has done extremely well. And one of the fun things is you can make new ones, because it goes down into the ground and it re-roots, and you can cut those off. And George has put a bunch of them around the back on trellises. So in many cases, you can take some of your more aggressive species and move them to places where you want them to be aggressive. And that has been great with the trumpet honeysuckle. One of the other species that's been really aggressive out here is the brown-eyed Susans, and they will definitely take over. But again, we've been able to dig up quite a few and give them away. Another kind of aggressive one is this lyre-leaf sage, but it is awfully pretty and really provides a lot of color with leaves, even when it's not in bloom. So one of the things that we've tried to pay a lot of attention to is our stormwater management. And actually, someone from Northern Virginia Soil and Water came out to visit us one day and gave us a little bit of direction. But we also realized right away that the value of having rain barrels and having our own water source would be terrific. So over the years, George and I were trainers, and so we got a couple of rain barrels for free. And our son, who now is often a young adult, painted them for us over the years. So this is one of our favorites, our hummingbird rain barrel. George did all the work to cut off the gutters and get them all lined up well. And then we also, in addition to the rain barrels, have tried to be careful about managing any other runoff of stormwater here on site. So this particular area that we're going to be walking down right now, which is very shady, we had a lot of water problems with runoff coming from our neighbors. So we did have a little underground water catchment installed, which then empties out at the back of our yard, which has been a huge help.
That was part of the original hardscape work. We had the step work going in, and you'll see stones in the back, but then they also dug an underwater drainage system because we're lower than our neighbor, and there was this whole section of the yard here was just sloppy swamp.
A river runs through it.
The river runs through it. It was nuts. And so we've got drainage now, and then the plants can be maintained, and it's dry, but that was an important part of the hardscape when we first started the project.
And what's nice too, of course, is initially it's a little bit hard to tell how your water is going to be managed until your plants come in. Of course, now I think the plants have spread quite well, and so we wouldn't have nearly as much trouble now. But it's hard when you're first planting.
Right.
So this area here was one where we completely replaced the lawn with plantings.
The other thing is with the rain barrels, we raise them up so we can use them with buckets or watering cans underneath. So when I place them, we brought in some larger stones to lift them to allow you to actually make them usable.
And of course, it's interesting when you're having native plants that you end up not having to water very much, but we do use the water for quite a lot of other things.
Right.
Washing out buckets. The grandchildren love to make soup out here with big buckets of water. So, and we do have some dry areas or times when we very rarely have to use in-house hose water because of the rain barrels, which is great. So this is really probably our favorite part of the yard. This we call it the shady side, and
Bird alley.
Bird alley, yes. And to a certain extent, just in terms of advising people when they're getting started, most people think about sunny gardens, but oftentimes shade is an easier place to start because things don't go crazy quite as quickly. They're a little bit more manageable. So this area, for example, to us is the most beautiful, but is also the easiest to maintain, over time. Wild ginger has just taken off beautifully. The phlox, unfortunately, we've missed the season a little bit for the phlox, and also foam flower, as well well as sensitive ferns. These are just a couple that do, so well in the shade. A lot of times the question comes up, how important is it that you have all native plants, or does it have to be all native to be sustainable? I think one of the things that we have to kind of remember is that our local insects and wildlife evolved along with the native plants. And what we're trying to do in many cases, for people who are familiar with Doug Tallamy, he's really promoting the Homegrown National Park, in that, our wild spaces are great, but they're not enough really to provide the functioning ecosystems that we need, for long-term survival of the planet. So anytime we can choose native plants, we're providing those sorts of ecosystem services, and wildlife habitat that sometimes our non-native plants are not able to provide. Having said that, if you have beautiful non-native plants that aren't aggressive, it's not necessary to replace them all. In fact, there's some important work on, I've forgotten the name of the book by Tallamy and Richard Dark.
I can get it.
Sorry, I can't remember the
I
book.
looked at it. I was looking at it this morning.
That says also that the world is evolving, and we can't expect to have the perfect native plant landscaping. But again, anytime we can, it's great. We have a Coosa dogwood out here that was beautiful, and we didn't need to replace that. It was a very healthy specimen. It's not invasive. The other question that comes up sometimes is cultivars. And what role do those play? And I think there has been a lot of research recently saying that local ecotype, like what Earth Sangha provides for us, and that's what most of our plants are, our local ecotype to Fairfax County, are always best. But sometimes cultivars that provide some other features are okay. On the other hand, some that provide different flower size, different blooming time, variegation of leaves, can be things that are not attractive to the native wildlife. So I think personally one of the fun things for George and I is doing the research. I've got him carrying books here because there's a lot of things that we consult.
She does the research and I do the planting. Right.
Is trying to decide, what is an okay cultivar and what isn't. And sometimes it's just what's available at your local nursery. We personally do love natives, but that is not the only kind of sustainable garden you can have.
And the native concept is actually what drew the attention to this year's tour, right? Because it's about the edible. You were emphasizing some of the edibles, and Kim and I laughed because we're not doing big gardens. You'll see maybe an example of little things that we do.
Vegetable gardening. The
vegetable gardening, but we provide a lot of edibles for the native wildlife around here, between the pollinators and the wildlife that comes through. So we chuckled and said, "Oh, we're a perfect place for that." So that's sort of
we're
how
just supporting the wildlife instead of the humans. One of the plants that we planted that turned out to be very aggressive, but in a good way, is golden ragwort. And unfortunately, we're just sort of missing the peak. But we started out with about 5 plants in this area. And over the last 9 years or so, we now have hundreds. And they've taken over pretty much this entire hillside that we're coming up on. But that's one of the beauties of native plants is how well they do, really, and how well they spread. And so an area that otherwise would have been taken over a little bit more, probably by invasives if it hadn't been taken over by golden ragwort, now has this terrific, mostly evergreen ground cover that also blooms for about a month. And one of the wonderful things about golden ragwort is it provides pollen for the very early pollinators, because it does bloom, oftentimes as early as March and then through April, when there aren't too many other things blooming. So it has just been a terrific plant, and we just dug up 40 and took them over to our son and daughter-in-law's house, and they planted them in their yard. So it's a plant that you can definitely share with friends. And one of the things you'll kind of notice as we walk on down the hillside here is when you're thinking about, it's definitely a trial and error process, and we're constantly just finding new things that we want to experiment with and put in. But you do want to think about the different seasons of blooming, so you're providing pollen and other ecosystem services for a variety of wildlife, but also height of plants. You want to have some shrubs, you want to have some trees, you want to have some low-growing things. And again, we were not experts. Most of this has just been trial and error and a lot of looking things up on websites and learning from other people, which is
and
really
moving
fun.
things around.
And moving things around, exactly. This was an interesting area here because, as you can see, it's really pretty steep. So George here had a real task of putting down black plastic, and it was basically just weedy. I think there were a few non-native shrubs that were in here, or
Right.
ground covers, and putting down the black plastic and then covering it with mulch. And then I think you also put another thing on the top to hold it over the course of the winter.
I think, yeah, we wintered it with just the plastic to kill underneath.
Yeah.
And then in the spring, after they laid the stone, then we newspapered it. And then
we planted
mulched.
in there.
We put
Yeah.
the mulch on top of the newspaper to give us a beginning of a planting surface.
And I think it does help to keep in mind when you are trying to get rid of lawn, that it is a process. And so you can dig up sod, which is really a lot of work, but if you have a season, you can use black plastic, newspaper, cardboard, and we've done that in a couple of other places too, and then plan to plant in the next season. Of course, plastic you would take up, but the cardboard or the newspaper you can
leave down,
and plant in it. But again, this has been a really interesting area. We planted quite a lot of things. There's turtle head, which does very well. You can see it and spread quite a bit. We have common milkweed coming up, and that spreads quite dramatically. Of course, common milkweed we have to have for the monarch caterpillars. It's their host plant. The golden ragwort again has spread quite a lot. Mint is a wonderful thing if you're trying to cover any particular area, and there's some beautiful native mountain mints. Joe pieweed is another one right here. And yeah, this is the Joe pieweed right here. Very identifiable because it has the whorl of leaves. And with some of these things, if you're trying to fix your heights a little bit, you can clip them off. Oh, some kind of little bug there. One of the things that we laugh about sometimes with the insects, I don't know if you've heard of the 10-step rule, that if you're not an insect lover, which you probably need to be since that's the point with native plants, just take 10 steps back. So it's the 10-step rule, take 10 steps back if there's something you don't want to see, and live and let live. We mentioned that we had a lot of trumpet honeysuckle, and George put up some trellises so that we could move honeysuckle back to these trellises that are on the posts. So we have a couple of those. One of the other plants that has done very, very well here, and you can see quite a lot of it here at George's feet, a good spreader is white wood aster, and it loves the shade and will spread quite dramatically. But again, in terms of seasons, that gives you just beautiful white flowers through your yard in September and October, because it's a fall bloomer and provides that bit of pollen for those late bees. One of the things that people ask about sometimes is, what does this look like in other seasons? And personally, I think it's very interesting because we've been of the philosophy, whether it's laziness or actually good for the environment, that you don't want to over clean outside. If you have to clean inside. And so we do leave the stalks up, we leave the seed pods, and you get a lot of interest. Of course, you've got birds coming in who are really taking advantage of any leftover seeds that you have. But there's just also a lot of interest. There's places for insects to hibernate. There's places for bees to hibernate inside stalks and in the mud and the ground. And then in the spring, as need be, we might come back out and do a little bit of cleanup so that there's room for the new plants to grow. But so it might not be everyone's vision of beauty in the winter, but to us, it really is very, very attractive.
No, it always looks very nice, and
seeing the birds out here, and having places for them to be. One of the kind of fun things too for the spring is we have a bluebird box. We're actually bluebird monitors over at South Run as well, so we have some familiarity with the process. And we don't have bluebirds in there right now, but there is a nest.
There's a nest, right?
And we have had a couple of successful years. George has got our little booklet of detailing
Eggs
from eggs
and
to
babies.
adults. And
we've watched them fledge. We've videotaped in past years fledging. That was pretty cool. That was one of our earliest years, and we were able to actually videotape it, and that was pretty
a
exciting.
lot of fun. One of the fun things too, sometimes when you're in the group of people who's into native plants and the environment and so forth, is you get sort of unique opportunities. So we were involved in a study a few years back, done by one of Doug Tallamy's students on the importance of native caterpillars for birds. And so they installed a chickadee box here, and we had multiple grad students coming out to count caterpillars in our environment, because as you know, in order to have birds, you have to have caterpillars, since the birds are, the young are dependent on that. And in order to have caterpillars, you have to have native plants, because our non-native plants don't support native caterpillars. And so that's been a lot of fun. So
that was pretty cool. We've done the bird monitoring, the bird banding project here in the yard, which was
from
Smithsonian team came out, and so they'd come out and they'd set up nets, and it was awesome. We would,
kids and grandkids.
We'd just be out here for a couple of hours collecting birds, measuring them, weighing them, taking down the data, and then releasing them. And that was a great couple of years where we were participating in that project.
So I think sometimes, when you do get involved in your local environment and your local organizations, with what you're doing, whether it's on your own property or your church property and so forth, so you get some unique opportunities. And we have our big compost pile here, again trying to treat as much of our waste on site. So there's the last 2 years probably worth of yard debris. Is in that pile, mostly weeds, because George shreds up the lawn mowings, the grass clippings from the little bit of lawn that we have, and we
compost it
back out. Right. This is sort of our experimental, we call it the North 40, our experimental hill with a lot of Northern Virginia soil and water seedlings over the years. And
pawpaws. We got our little pawpaws here, which the animals like to,
they ate all the pawpaws last year. Those are from Northern Virginia Soil and Water. 3 of them.
You see the little baby one in the middle. So we have 3, and we'll see what they do. And you can see the couple flowering. It's still flowering. And then on the back fence, you have some of the mason bees, little mason bee house for the pollinators. And they're really fun to watch. I built a house and then bought those 2 from Costco, and we like to promote the pollinators, so they take full advantage of that.
So we wanted a specimen tree in this spot, and decided that native magnolia would be a great choice, and it really has done very well. But I think this is a good example that this is a cultivar, because if we put a full-size southern magnolia in this spot, it would have been too much. It would have overgrown the space. But in this case, the cultivar only affects the size that the tree gets. And so, from our research, that's kind of an acceptable cultivar, as opposed to one that affects bloom time or size of flowers or color and that sort of thing, which can often have a negative impact and be unattractive to pollinators. So this is kind of a good example of when a cultivar is not a bad thing, when you're trying to fit something into a space. This is a tower garden, and as we mentioned, we're not doing a lot with human edibles in our yard, but because of issues with deer and so forth. But this has been the perfect solution, because it's up here on our patio where the deer don't come, although the raccoons and the squirrels and the chipmunks do get up here. And you can grow anything in here, but we mostly have chosen to grow greens, usually kale and chard and lettuce and spinach, because that's the sort of thing we love to come out and just pick every day for a salad.
Some herbs.
Yeah, and some herbs, exactly. Cilantro, parsley, basil sometimes. And it just does really well. One of the really cool things is it's actually a composter. So George puts the compost in there. And then you want to show him, George, about the drawer?
Yeah, so what happens is,
Oops.
you've got compost, just scraps and clippings all go in there. It composts down, which makes compost tea for the plants, right? Water, rain comes through, and it drips, and it gives it a richer water source. And then it collects, and you can see it's a little bit over full. It's a 2-gallon bucket in here, and we take it out, and then we just use it to rewater.
So it's like compost tea down
right.
there. So these things are not inexpensive, unfortunately, but they are just perfect for this kind of
Love the
situation.
cilantro and the
Yeah.
parsley and different herbs and peppers. We'll get some hot peppers up here a little bit later this summer.
So it's kind of a fun little
A
extra
few
thing.
flowers. We'll put in a few marigolds and things just for fun, and then we'll do tomatoes. We're doing in separate pots because they're bigger plants. So
But if this stuff was down in the yard, unfortunately, it would get demolished by
our critters.
the critters, and that's okay. So we do our own little vegetable gardening over here on the deck.
It's on the back side, not the front side, but it's okay.
You know, for some of the certifications that you do for, National Wildlife Federation, Audubon at Home, and some of those, actually Secretary, they require a water source as well to, provide water for the animals. And so, interestingly, we use the lids that come with the Northern Virginia Soil and Water rain barrels for little bird baths on the ground. And then we also have had this little pond. It's not filled up yet, but we usually have a water lily and some other things. And we've had little parties of robins come and have like a little sauna day. They all sit around and take their baths and so forth, so it's really fun. So
During the winter months, we'll put a heater. I put a heater in it, so we keep the water all year round, even when it's freezing, which birds really like. And so they.
So having some sort of water if you
Water
can, and of
source.
course you do have to be careful with mosquitoes, and so we do put a little bit of the powder stuff in there to keep the mosquito larvae.
And I
from-
clean the bird bath every
days.
every couple days.
Yeah.
Rinse it and dump it.
But gosh, I mean, I just can't highly recommend enough, people getting into, native plants and sustainable gardening. I feel like it's, just like with this concept of the Homegrown National Park, it's so important that people take whatever space they do have, whether it's their balcony or their townhouse yard or their farm or whatever, and just try to make it a natural environment that because we just don't have enough ecosystem services when all we have is lawn, and the national parks, the local parks, that's not enough. We really need to have everybody's personal space be supporting the environment and the wildlife.